Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fiscal Focus at DawnNews English. I am Danish Khan. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Kugelman. He's director of South Asia Institute at Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Michael has been writing on South Asia, in particular Pakistan, and his writings have featured in New York Times, Foreign Affairs. And thank you, Michael, for joining me today.
Thanks. Great to be here with you.
Yeah. So I want to start with the USAID. It's been in the news. And how do you think the cutting USAID and defunding those projects, how it's going to impact US-Pakistan relationship?
I think it will have a notable impact. Yeah, I think we should not overstate the amount of USAID assistance that had been going into Pakistan during the last few years. The numbers were considerably lower than they were some decades ago. But if you look at how the relationship had evolved in recent years, I would argue that many of the key focus areas of the relationship were very linked to USAID activities. So, for instance, humanitarian assistance, cooperation around climate change mitigation, clean energy, and of course, public health, education. These are areas where USAID support had been quite instrumental. So I think from that angle, I mean, given that the relationship had been structured around topics that had been very dependent on USAID support, I think that will have an impact on the relationship. But I will say this that for many years we've heard Pakistani officials say when talking about relations with the U.S. that they want to focus on trade, not aid. But that had never really happened because you had had that continuous level of aid coming in. Trade between the U.S. and Pakistan, has gone up or had gone up in recent years, but was not on, really high levels. So maybe you could argue that since there's no more aid, that there will be a silver lining, and that Pakistan and the U.S. could try to focus more on ramping up commercial relations. Though certainly that will not be easy given the structural economic challenges that Pakistan faces.
Do you think there's a new opportunity for Pakistan now, given that traditional aid structures have been dismantled? So maybe Pakistan can now focus more on FDI. And do you think what are the
Yeah,
prospects?
it's a good question. We hear so much about how the Trump administration why wants countries to buy America, purchase American products. And, Pakistan very quietly has purchased a number of key American products like cotton from Texas, as well as soybeans and other things, not on the level that you have countries like India importing, but it is happening. And there might be an advantage here for U.S.-Pakistan relations against the backdrop of this incoming reciprocal tariff policy that the administration is going to be imposing. That policy will hurt the most those countries that trade heavily with the U.S., where there's heavy trade disparities against going against the U.S. But with Pakistan, there's relatively little trade. I mean, in Pakistan is buying America, but not on levels high enough where it has to worry about getting hit hard by tariffs. So I think that might be a silver lining for the relationship. But if you talk about FDI, yes, I mean I think in theory there might be an opportunity there. But what I look at when I think about this notion of U.S. investment, U.S. foreign investment in Pakistan, what I point to is the DFC, the International Development Finance Corporation, which is a relatively new U.S. entity which is focused on essentially sponsorship of infrastructure investments in the Indo-Pacific. Pakistan is not formally a part of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. It never has been. I don't think it will be in this administration. But the DFC now it still has to be reauthorized by the Congress. But if it is, there might be an opportunity here for it to try to look into sponsoring some projects in Pakistan. And I think the administration would be supportive of this so long as it looks at the DFC as a strategic tool to counter China's influence, which I suspect would be the case. And there has been a slowdown with CPEC investments in recent years, so there might be an opportunity here for the U.S. And Pakistan to scale up investment cooperation. I don't want to overstate the possibilities, a lot of obstacles, but it is an opportunity at least.
How would you describe now in the hindsight, what was the Biden administration approach towards Pakistan?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I see an irony here, in that if we tap into undercurrents of Pakistani domestic politics, you've heard many times from supporters of Imran Khan that the Biden administration was, essentially, backing the quote unquote military junta in Pakistan, and making this suggestion that the Biden administration was like more tightly embracing the Pakistani military. But I would argue that the Biden administration's ties with Pakistan, including the military and the government, and the state on the whole, were actually some of the most aloof that we've seen from any U.S. administration in quite some time. You're absolutely right. There was not much engagement, and we had several rounds of sanctions that the Biden administration imposed on Pakistan for its ballistic missile program. And I think that why was this the case? This is a case of the U.S. withdrawal making Washington focus much less strategic attention and less attention on the whole on Pakistan. I think this is a bad thing, but for so many years, U.S. officials have looked at the relationship with Pakistan through the lens of Afghanistan. And once U.S. troops and U.S. personnel had left Afghanistan, that lens was gone, and there was nothing that replaced it, so to speak. There were no new, really strong anchors that emerged, other than some of those that we had discussed before. Climate change, humanitarian support. There was a little bit of counterterrorism cooperation through a bilateral U.S.-Pakistan counterterrorism dialogue. Maybe we'll talk a bit more about that later. But there really wasn't much there, so to speak, just because the strategic outlook in Washington had changed. And so the Biden administration, really had no incentive to be, engaging very closely with the administration in Pakistan.
Now, with the new administration in town, here I'm talking about Trump administration, do you expect any qualitative shift in the US administration attitude towards Pakistan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're going to see a fair amount of continuity, and we saw with the previous administration, engagement with Pakistan. There was some of it. It was largely led by the State Department, and USAID was, of course, very involved, but there really wasn't much going on. And I think that'll be the case now. I mean, there will be some notable changes. Of course, there's likely going to be no USAID, and as we discussed, that will have an impact on the structure and the parameters of the relationship. And so, some of the key areas of cooperation that we had in the Biden era will not be there anymore. Anything involving clean energy, climate change, and so on. So it'll be, I think, limited objectives, limited interests with the new administration, much like we had with the previous one. But as we saw with the disclosure that President Trump made that Pakistan helped the U.S. apprehend an IS, an Islamic State terrorist, I think that this administration, like the last administration, will look to Pakistan to help when it comes to certain very specific tactically based counterterrorism asks, including cases where the U.S. has information about the location of a terrorist that the U.S. wants to apprehend. We still don't know exactly who the U.S. was working with when it undertook the operation in Afghanistan several years ago that took out Ayman al-Zawahiri, the Al-Qaeda leader. I wouldn't be surprised if Pakistan let the U.S. use its airspace. So similar things to, so I think that it's going to be similar in the sense that the Trump administration would want to look at Pakistan as a limited partner on counterterrorism issues, just like the Biden administration did, but without wanting to really advance that partnership in a big way.
Now, as you know, I mean, in the Pakistan, the political situation is quite complex, and it's been evolving in the past few years. And one big factor there is the PTI and incarceration of the former Prime Minister Imran Khan. And the PTI USA has aggressively lobbied politicians and policymakers in Washington, and especially the GOP politicians. Now, do you expect any pressure on Pakistan from Washington on this front?
Yeah, it's an important question, especially now. I mean, as you know, we have a bill being drafted on the House side, led by a member of Congress who's very close to President Trump. And this is not just a bill that calls for supporting democracy in Pakistan. It actually um, calls for a process that could impose sanctions on the Pakistani army chief and on others in Pakistan that are taking steps to keep Imran Khan in jail. So this would have major implications. And I think there's been a lot of questions as to whether because this is being led by someone who's close to Trump, that it could get the administration's attention. My view is that we should not expect the Trump administration, including Trump himself, to pressure Pakistan to free Khan. For a number of reasons. And here I know that the very passionate PTI support base would violently disagree with me. But for me, it all comes down to a question that I don't think we have a good answer for. The question is, what would be in it for President Trump to try to pressure the Pakistan to free Khan, right? What would be in it for him? How would this serve America? How would it serve his personal interest? How would it serve America's interest? And these are the key framing questions that will govern any U.S. foreign policy decision. And I don't see an answer to that question. What is it about a foreign political leader in Pakistan, of all places, that would make Trump want to help, would want to pressure Pakistan to free him? Now, the arguments that PTI and its supporters make, I don't think are very convincing. So one argument they make is that that Trump himself sees himself a lot like Khan. Like Khan, he feels he's been victimized by the deep state, so to speak. That he sees Khan as a friend, and he'd like to reach out and help a friend. And Trump is all about being loyal to his friends. I have no reason to think that Trump sees Khan as a friend, quite frankly. I mean, yes, he invited him to Washington when he was president the first time. Khan was prime minister. They hit it off well. He didn't invite Khan. They didn't, that he invited Khan to Washington because he wanted Khan and Pakistan more broadly to help with the talks with the Taliban that led to the withdrawal deal in the Doha Accord. They met one or two more times. They met at Davos. But I have no reason to think that, Trump views him as a close friend, so to speak. Um, and I just think that with everything he's going to be thinking about right now, I mean, he's the president of the United States. There's all kinds of things on his mind. A foreign political leader, Imran Khan, is quite frankly not going to be high on the list. Now, there'd been some time soon before Trump took office that I thought that it could be that we might see him occasionally post a message on social media expressing support, solidarity for Khan, especially since we'd seen some U.S. political figures that will be serving or that are now serving in the administration that have brought attention to Khan in social media posts. But I think here the Sharifullah raid is very important. Again, this is a case of very senior U.S. officials, including the CIA and FBI directors, reaching out to their counterparts in Pakistan, asking them to help the U.S. track down a terrorist that had killed Americans. And the Pakistanis did that. They helped. And so I think that it's very clear to me that President Trump and his administration, even though they may not want to work with Pakistan that much, even though they may be very critical, and they are very critical of the Pakistani military, they see that it can be helpful in certain contexts. And I think that they would conclude that they need to retain equities with the Pakistani establishment, keep things on good terms. And if they were to start pressuring Pakistan, the Pakistani military to free Khan, if they were to start supporting legislation that could lead to sanctions on the Pakistani military, that would really damage U.S. relations with Pakistan and the military. And even if these are just very limited counterterrorism goals that the U.S. might have, it does see Pakistan as a country that can be helpful in that regard. So that's all to say that I really don't think that we're going to see Trump make that push for Khan's release.
No, I think it makes sense because especially the foreign policy calculus is tied with the state interest, and I don't think the individual centric explanation can help us understand how the foreign policy decisions are made. And also the pressure on Pakistan on in terms of like US senators or Congress folks posting things like in favor of former Prime Minister Khan, help administration leverage with the administration on many other issues, right? So that pressure we may continue to see, but the final push, I tend to agree with you on this issue. Now, looking into as you closely observe Pakistan and you write on those issues as well. Now, since 2018, that term was coined in the context of the former Prime Minister Khan, and at that time the army chief Bajwa, that they call it hybrid regime. So, and we have seen the continuation of that hybrid regime uh, since then. So, how do you compare and contrast the previous hybrid regime with the contemporary hybrid regime in Pakistan?
Well, I mean, I think that the current hybrid regime is much even more uh, army dominated than the previous one. We see the army. I mean, this is quite ironic given that the army is facing significant levels of pressures, both internal and external. But the army is now, I would argue, exerting much more influence over economic policy than we saw during the Khan era. And even during, the government that succeeded Khan, prior to the election in Pakistan last year, SIFC, which, of course, the Special Investment Facilitation Council, is that what it is?
Yes.
Um, this is something that appears to be largely driven by the army chief, right? I mean, he plays a very key role on it. And Pakistan's government has described the SIFC as a critical focus of its in economic policy, its international economic policy, which is meant on attracting investment. It's been given this very strong level of prestige. It's a priority. It targets critical allies of Pakistan, like the Saudis and other Gulf states. And this is something that Munir is driving, and so that to me is something that shows just how involved the military is in economic politics, economic policy, and as you know, I mean the hybrid regime model, it works best when the civilians basically step back and defer. And, of course, when Khan was in government, that's when things started falling apart, when he pushed back. But, this current government is led by a prime minister who I think is much more deferential to the military than Khan would ever be. And certainly he's more deferential to the military than his brother, Nawaz, would ever be, and has ever been in the past. So I think that, quite frankly, the army has its guy as prime minister. And I think that will make it more likely that this hybrid regime model will last. Now, we all know that we've never had a case of an elected civilian government serve out its full term in Pakistan. Could this be that time? I don't know, but again, the hybrid regime model seems to be working very well right now, even though there's all kinds of other problems on the political side, the confrontations between the military and Khan, the army sentiment. But I think that otherwise things are good. The army has things where it wants them.
Now, there's a lot of talk about the new Cold War emerging between the US and China, and recently, folks within the Trump administration spoke about ending the war in Ukraine and pivoting towards China. And that brings Pakistan in the limelight because Pakistan has historically close ties with both China and its Western allies, including the US. So, do you think the current geostrategic environment allow Pakistan to continue this relationship with both China and the US?
Yeah, I mean it's facing challenges with both of these key partners. I think that it's very clear that this is how Pakistan wants things to be. I mean, it wants to make this case that it can successfully balance ties with both Beijing and Washington. To be very candid, in Washington, there's a lot of skepticism about that idea. I mean, here there's a view that Pakistan is essentially in China's camp. Um, but I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's how the leadership in Pakistan sees things. Um, yeah, I think it will be tough, though. I do think that Islamabad will be able to maintain those relationships, though I think that its relationship with China, despite the tensions that have crept in because of security concerns and all, I think it'll be much easier to manage that relationship than it will be with the one with the US, just for the reasons that I mentioned before, that I don't think the Trump administration will be all that inclined to engage with Pakistan. However, I will say this, understanding, I mean, if Islamabad recognizes the fact that the administration is very focused on competition with China, particularly the economic sides of competition with China. If Pakistan can pitch itself in a way that might help advance U.S. strategic goals when it comes to China. And here I come back to the DFC issue. If Pakistan tries to make this pitch to the administration, well, look, We're keen to be a place where the U.S. will invest more. I'm sure we're sure there are ways that you could deliver in ways that China cannot. I'm not using those words, but anyway, I do think there is perhaps a way to move the needle forward in Pakistan's relations with the U.S. if it's able to make this case that doing so can push back against China. But at the same time, Pakistan needs China. It can't afford to lose China. It can't afford to be in a situation where China is concerned that Pakistan is moving much closer to the U.S. So it'll be difficult. But I think that in answering the question literally, Pakistan, I mean, there's no reason why Pakistan can't continue to have workable relations with both countries.
You also closely follow India as well. So now, in terms of this new Cold War, it seems like more closer ties between the US and India. Now, and that also creates a lot of anxiety in policymakers in both Islamabad and Rawalpindi. And they wouldn't want India, US to completely stop engaging with Islamabad. So is there any way you can expect, or what are some prospects that Islamabad try more to engage with Washington?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've tried to make a case for, though it may be a bit too ambitious, maybe it's a bit too optimistic, that pardon me, Pakistan can position itself as a mediator between the U.S. and China. And of course, we all think of the example back when, Pakistan played that intermediary role when President Nixon was looking to normalize relations with Beijing. The best motivation that you had for Pakistan playing that role, I think, no longer applies. So I had argued during the Biden administration, the U.S. was very concerned about um, climate change and recognizing that you need to talk to China if you want to have a global, want to have an impact globally on reducing emissions. But climate change is not something that the administration would have much interest engaging on with any country, including China. So that possibly, that potential utility that Pakistan could have as a as a mediator may no longer be there. And I would also argue that even though we're talking about intense U.S.-China competition, President Trump has indicated that he wants to engage with Beijing, and he could engage with Beijing if he wanted to. I mean, he could meet with President Xi, which I imagine he may do soon enough. He had a call with him some time ago, and so in other words, the U.S. wouldn't need Pakistan to play that role of intermediary to bring the U.S. and China together. So that's sort of a problem. There's really not much that Pakistan can do to prevent the U.S. and India from continuing to build on this exponentially deepening security partnership. I mean, there are some issues in the U.S.-India relationship, particularly in the trade side, but the security partnership continues to grow, and I just don't think there's much that Pakistan could do about that. I mean, even if the U.S. finds itself in a better position to sponsor infrastructure projects in Pakistan that counter China. I mean, at the end of the day, the U.S. is going to have a strong strategic interest in continuing to pursue partnership with India, unless you have an end to U.S.-China competition and there's some type of grand rapprochement. I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Although that would be a big win-win for everyone if the US China can settle things and
Mhm.
establish some working relationship. Now the final thing question. Now, given the Trump administration's America First approach, the discourse on democracy and human rights has been pushed on the back burner. Now, this looking at South Asia, you understand there are a lot of issues of like human rights issues and minorities issues. Now, would that allow all South Asian governments, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, more free hand in terms of repression, or we expect some pushback?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I'm not sure that, even when you had the Biden administration with its what one could best describe as a selective focus on democracy and human rights in countries around the region and the world, in countries that were being pressured by the US to rein in their rights violations and all. I mean, nothing changed. I mean, there was no impact. And we saw Bangladesh as, I think, the big example where the U.S. Made that a big part of its values-based foreign policy in the Biden era. There were sanctions on a paramilitary group. You had visa restrictions put on some folks before the election, and you had an election that was not free and fair. You had continuing levels of autocracy until, of course, last summer you had a mass movement led by Bangladeshis against the government, which led it to go. So I wouldn't overstate the influence that U.S. pressure on the rights front could have had on these countries to rein in. And of course, we know with India, the Biden administration took a very cautious, quiet approach. It
Mm.
brought these issues up quietly, but for strategic reasons, didn't bring them up all that much and on public levels that much. So yeah, and it's true that you have an administration now that I think is more interest based, has a more interest based foreign policy than any U.S. administration going back maybe to the Nixon administration. And this is another reason, quite frankly, why we shouldn't expect Trump to focus on Imran Khan and this notion of supporting democracy in Pakistan. I simply don't see why that would be at all a priority for him or his administration. It just is not relevant at all to how they look at the world. Um, so yeah, but I mean, but indeed, I mean, one of the big trends in South Asia in recent years has been this downward slide when it comes to democracy. But I think that if you're going to have reversals in those slides, it's going to depend on internal factors, not factors like what the US might be doing or saying.
I totally agree. I mean, that's a great point to end. It is the grassroots and organic movements within those countries that can really empower the disadvantaged and historically marginalized, and strengthening of democracy depends on those internal factors. Thank you so much, Michael, for your time, and I really enjoyed talking with you. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Until next time, this is Danish Khan signing off from Fiscal Focus at Dawn News English.